Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get started in just a moment. If you could please take your seats. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany McGee, and I'm the Next Generation Officer here at the Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our February Young Professionals program. We are in for a fantastic discussion tonight on the Millennial Voting Agenda. What is it, and how are the political parties in America addressing issues important to young voters? But first, let's begin with a few housekeeping points. Tonight's program is live and on the record, so please silence your phones, but keep them out as we're conducting some live polling on tonight's discussion. We want to hear your take on the Millennial Agenda, as well as your views on how our parties are leading. Additionally, we'll be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screens on either side of me. To vote in our poll, and please vote in our poll, or submit a question, simply type chi.cnf.io into your device browser and select tonight's program. Also, don't forget to engage with us on social media and use the hashtag CouncilYP in your posts. Although, as you're tweeting, please know that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We engage not only the nation and world's top leaders, but also Chicago's next generation of leaders, with programming to increase your global fluency and augment your cultural competence. I encourage you, if you are not yet a member with us, I see a lot of members in the room, but if you're not yet a member with us, to please consider joining and participating in our YP network. If you're interested and want to learn more, you can see our YP ambassadors. They are on the right-hand side of the room. They'll be there throughout the program and after and can talk to you about joining the Council. Back to tonight's program. Generation Y, or millennials, are now the most populous living generation in the United States. The capacity for this demographic cohort to drive public policy is vast, and many in the political sphere are eager to analyze their impact on the current state of affairs. A key question remains: how are U.S. parties keeping in step with the changing demographic voter makeup and potential new landscape of political priorities? Diving into this question tonight, we have a great panel. Craig Kafura is a public opinion research associate at the Council. He works on the Council's annual public opinion on foreign policy survey and recently helped lead a survey specifically on intergenerational perspectives on American foreign policy. Congresswoman Raman Kelly is currently a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, serving in Illinois' 2nd Congressional District. She is a member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee and the senior Illinois representative on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as co-chair of the Congressional Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls, and the Congressional Diversifying Technology Caucus. Congressman Bob Dole is a former U.S. representative for Illinois' 10th Congressional District, serving 2 terms. He served on the Financial Services Committee, Ways and Means Committee, and as an investigative counsel for the House Government Reform and Oversight Committee. And moderating tonight's discussion is Natasha Korecki. Natasha is a senior reporter for Politico and author of Illinois Playbook. Prior to Politico, she was a chief political writer at the Chicago Sun-Times, covering state, national, and city politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, thank you, everyone, very much. I'm Natasha Korecki. Great to be here today. And just wanted to start off with a few comments about millennials. As we were already talking about, they're now the most populous living generation in the United States. And as the most sizable demographic in the electoral system, the importance of their opinions and values in shaping future policies and political institutions is more important than ever. With increased demographic, political, technological, and global shifts to their core platforms, how will the Republican Democratic parties engage millennials? How will their parties address millennial concerns and pressing issues on immigration, climate change, and terrorist threats? So first, who are we talking about? Pew Research Center defines Millennial Generation as being born between 1981 and 1997. They are now 20 to 37 years old. And there's further Pew Research data that outlines this demographic as the most likely generation of Americans to use public libraries. They're more likely to have a bachelor's degree than previous generations, and in many countries are more open than their elders on questions of national identity. So we're going to start off with a question to both Representatives Kelly and Dole. What do you see happening on the ground in Washington? Where is the party headed, right now? Why don't we start with you, Kelly?
As far as where we're headed now, well, the obvious is we're trying to win in 2018, and much of our focus is on that, to take back the House, because we are very much in the minority. We're 24 members down, and I think we're trying to do that really through the lens of an economic message: economics, jobs, better pay, better opportunity, better future.
And I suspect there's another gun debate that's going to be.
What's
happening with
I didn't know if you wanted me to go there. But
Why not get it?
yeah, when we go back, I hope that there is, and I hope it's not a debate, that that is something near and dear to my heart, gun violence prevention, and actually Bob Dole and I work together on that, trying to get a better background check bill passed, but we never had the opportunity because it was never presented on the floor. But yes, I definitely expect that discussion to occur when we go back on Monday, and as well as, we're in the throes of the budget, and we'll be talking about the wall again, and of course on March 5th, that's the deadline for the Dreamers, so that'll be something else that we will be discussing.
Representative
Dole. First of all, it's great to be here. Delighted to be here with my good friend Robin Kelly, and I do want to applaud her for the work that she is doing on trying to reduce gun violence. It's something that is obviously very critical to our community, but critical across the country. As we look at kind of what's going on for the party, what's happening on the ground in Washington, obviously you're going to have what's going on with the Dreamers. My sense is that will be extended. We need to do something with regard to immigration reform. I was actually pleased to see the administration come out to say that they are actually open to background checks with regard to some of the gun legislation that potentially could be proposed, which would be a huge step forward. We're going to try to address infrastructure, which is something that, again, should be a widely bipartisan scenario. And we're going to see what happens with regard to tax reform. I think there's a lot of things with regard to the tax bill that passed that need to be addressed, largely because the vehicle that was used to pass tax reform was a very narrow vehicle, and therefore they had to turn some dials to make sure it was able to get through. My guess is there's going to have to be some additional legislation. My hope is bipartisan legislation to try to fix that going forward. So I think that there is a full agenda. Unfortunately, as Congresswoman just stated, we are in the throes of midterms, which are in theory around the corner, and therefore that really lowers the expectations for getting a lot of stuff done, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of need.
Okay. And Craig, if you could talk a little bit, many pundits and political analysts have observed increasing distrust and disillusionment in the U.S. political system and party representatives, particularly during the 2016 presidential election campaign. Could you talk a little bit about the recent or significant changes in millennial public opinion trends toward the political system and parties?
Sure. And very nice to be here. Glad so many of you came out on such a rainy night. So it is an interesting question. There was a lot of debate during 2016 about disillusionment with parties, with the nominees, with the candidates. You saw this both on the right and the left. The right obviously had a very controversial nominee. A lot of party members decided that they were just going to oppose the nominee, dissociate themselves from the party to a certain extent. That said, there hasn't been a huge shift among millennials specifically away from identifying with a party. What you have seen is an increase in distrust in institutions more broadly. But that's also not limited to millennials. The distrust in American institutions is far more widespread, and it's been going on for quite a long time. Confidence in institutions, as tracked by Gallup, is down 10, 15, 20 points over the last 30 years. And this is not limited to a single institution. They look at all major institutions in society, ranging from police and unions to the military and Congress. Congress has never been particularly popular. Sorry. It's an easy punch.
Likes me.
That's what counts.
It falls off after paid staff and family.
And the reason that, because Congress is always so unpopular, everyone likes to run against Congress. So you get a lot of rhetoric that sounds anti-party, anti-institution. I'm going to Washington to clean up Washington. I'm not from Washington. I'm an outsider. It's a very popular message. It's always been a popular message. I'm pretty sure that in ancient Rome, people were running against ancient Rome. But just because there's been this mistrust of institutions doesn't mean that they're turning their backs on political parties or the political system. I think in some ways they're going to be more engaged in the next election than they were in 2016.
So to that extent, I mean, are parties doing things to reach out and to make sure that there is this engagement despite all the disillusionment? You guys can talk a little bit about your respective parties and some things that you've seen that have been, efforts to reach out.
Well, there's certainly been an increase in Twitter. I think there's certainly been an increase in Twitter, certainly in terms of reaching out. And as you look at millennials and kind of where they get their news from, it far surpasses other generations in terms of they're on social media, Facebook, et cetera, in terms of how they get their news. I think that the Republicans have been behind the Democrats in terms of social media and trying to engage constituents, millennials. And so I really get away from the party apparatus and really more focus on the campaigns. How are campaigns being run today, and how are they being able to reach out to millennials, which was stated before as the largest voting demographic? The difficulty is that the seniors, baby boomers, others, they vote more regularly than the millennials do. And so I think there's going to be a big push to try to make sure millennials are informed, and they're trying to get them to the polls. And so that's going to be done, I think, largely with social media is kind of the main vehicle that Republicans, or more specifically, that individual candidates will use.
And, there's, to say that there's going to be a big push, what can you do? I mean, I'm thinking about I think it was last election cycle, you had Chance the Rapper do a concert, and then he's like, everybody, let's walk down the polls. And I mean, that definitely engaged a lot of people. Short of having him, is there something more you can do besides going over Twitter to reach out to this demographic?
Well, I think that one thing that we started doing, and I cannot remember the name of it, but the younger members of Congress, and not that there's a lot of them, but the younger members of Congress, they started traveling the country. So Eric Swalwell from California, he's one of the younger members. So he came to my district, and we met with, we went to the college in my district, and we met with younger people, and then he traveled, and Jan Schakowsky, we met with younger people on another side of town, and he and Joe Kennedy and some of the others have been doing that to have face-to-face conversation with people and helping us baby boomers. And the other thing is, I don't think people realize is, I was just saying in the green room, I have 15 and a half staff members, and out of my 15 and a half, only 4 are not millennials, right? A lot of young people really run Washington, D.C.
Absolutely.
We're just the window dressing. But so that is helpful too, like with their ideas and them helping to pass the word. The other thing is like I helped start the Caucus on Black Women and Girls. So not only reaching out to older Black women, but younger Black women and girls who are not ready to vote yet. And you can see from the Alabama election, Black women really made the difference in that election.
So that's something in your district, you're reaching out to what, high schoolers or?
Oh, yeah, we do all kind of programs throughout we've done just on self-esteem, on human and sex trafficking, all kind of programs on health and wealth and things like that. So, and then we also had a STEM academy, so we reached out to younger people through that also.
Yeah. I did something similar in terms of Young Women's Leadership Academy. Victoria's in the back helped me with regard to doing all those types of things, but really specifically targeting, young women to get into the STEM fields, to make sure that they know what's available to them, bring in outside speakers, get them exposed to a lot of stuff around the district. Certainly helpful, because obviously in those networks they talk to all of their friends, and that's obviously one of those things that, regardless of political party, is something that we need to do in terms of reaching out and making sure people are aware.
And you're right, absolutely right, that millennials are this huge potential voting bloc, but they really don't turn out to vote in the numbers they should. Less than half of millennials reported voting in 2016. So they're a giant, but they're also a sleeping giant.
Do you think that'll change? You see all sorts of different kinds of activism going on, particularly now. I hear some chuckling. What do you see? Do you see any more activism on the way?
I think you'll see millennial voting rates go up as they get older. That's usually how this process works. Part of the problem with millennial voting is that they're moving around a lot. And even so, let's say you're in college. Depending on the state you live in, you may or may not be able to register the place where you live on college. Right? If you're from a different state, you may actually have to register to vote in your home state. Some states are looking at whether they want college students voting in their elections or not. If you move frequently, you need to re-register to vote. That's another step of the process. And if you miss the deadline, you can't vote this year. So the more mobile this young generation is, the harder it is for them to register to vote. Other states are doing other things. Washington is making it much easier to vote. I think Colorado has full vote by mail at this point. So depending on the state, you'll see different levels of turnout.
And we have automatic voter registration here in Illinois now, right?
But also, I think when I think about people running for office, you see younger people voting, like someone I just spoke to today that's running for, he's a millennial state rep and state central committeeman, and the person that's going to take my state rep's place as voting, he's, I think, 35, and he's taking the place of someone that I think is 65 or 66. So, and both of them have talked about the volunteers that they have, and they're younger volunteers. So I think that gets more people involved too. And we know someone, I think she was 29, and she, when she said she was going to run, like, you are? And she's on the board of Prairie State College in my district. She won, and it was a lot of young people that mobilized to make sure that happened.
Wow. Well, let's turn to third parties and independent voters. Recent council data from 2017 has revealed that 26% of millennials identify themselves as independents. Data from University of Chicago indicates that 60 to 70% of millennial voters believe that a third party is needed. So is our two-party system in danger? Is it possible for a third party to gain considerable traction nationally?
I don't think they're
Open to anyone.
So I'll start with this. So here's the secret about independence. Most people that say they're independent actually lean to a party. And if you look at their stances on issues, they don't just lean to a party. They look like strong partisans of that party. They are more partisan than people who say, yeah, I'm a Democrat or Republican, but not very strong. They're stealth partisans. They are. And the reason that people don't want to say they're partisans is because they think it makes them look bad. It makes them look too focused on politics. There was a great experiment actually done by a political scientist up at Northwestern, Yana Krupnikov, who asked people to introduce themselves and state their politics. And when you ask them to talk about their politics to somebody else, they want to say they're an independent because it makes them sound smart and reasonable. And, well, I'm not going to take a side on that issue. I'm independent. But then when you get in the voting booth, you're going to vote party line. There are some Americans who are truly independent. They do not prefer one party or the other. However, and unfortunately for third parties, they're also just politically disconnected. They're much less likely to follow the news. They're much less likely to vote. Most of them are not registered to vote. They simply don't engage in politics. And that's also a problem. It's not good that a growing percentage of the population is unengaged in politics. But it doesn't mean that a third party is about to explode out of nowhere.
But I mean, I guess in my reporting, what I see is, first there was this emergence of the Tea Party, and now you keep hearing about, the Tea Party of the left. those who are, for instance, very involved in this, Marie Newman, Dan Lipinski, saying that Lipinski's too conservative of a Democrat. Is that as much of a third party as you think we'll see? It's kind of like more of an extreme of one party or the other?
Let me just speak to that a little bit. I think that over the course of history, we've seen the Green Party. We've had others that have come in and really acted more as a spoiler. Yes, there were people that rallied behind them, but they really ended up being a spoiler for the other side. So, you'd find people that would jump in and have a third party run, but what was it? It was really dividing the Democratic Party or dividing the Republican Party. So, really we look at the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, it's really kind of dividing that one side. So the Tea Party, which emerged several years back, really was a sense of trying to divide the Republican Party. And again, what we find today is far more polarization going on than, frankly, I think is what people want. I think most people will identify themselves as far more between the 40-yard lines, if I can use a football analogy, and yet most of the politics that we see are in the red zones, whether it be Republican or Democrat, they're going to those sides. And I largely blame redistricting, whether it be Illinois, Texas, you name it. It doesn't matter kind of where you are, or it really depends on which party's in power. They want to draw the lines in such a fashion to create lock districts for those individual parties. And so consequently what you have is not, is a Republican going to the House of Representatives or the State House, it's which one, or is a Democrat going, it's which one. And therefore people are running hard to the right or hard to the left, which creates this sense of bewilderment for those in the middle because there's really not a place for them. We're seeing that bore out today as we see more and more of those more centrist folks, centrist members being targeted and therefore saying, forget it, I'm retiring. And that's a real problem, I think, for the country.
And I don't think the two-party system is in trouble. Just another side of it is because of finances. Money plays such a big role. That's one thing, we have got to get the money out of politics because it keeps good people from running, winning, or staying in because you're raising money every second, depending on what your district is, to run for office or stay in office. And I think it would be hard for a third party to get in the game, frankly.
If you're curious about third parties, I would keep an eye on Maine. And I say that because they just changed their voting system. So nationally, and most places in the US do this, we use something called first past the post. You get a majority, you get the most votes, you win, period. Which means when you have 3 or 4 or 5 parties running, you can win with less than the majority of the vote. But Maine has adopted something called instant runoff voting, which means you rank your preferences. So if your first choice doesn't get it, your vote isn't wasted. Will this change Maine politics forever? Stay tuned. 2018 will be the first time that they've run it in Maine.
I also think is it Minnesota or somewhere? I'm trying to,
Yes, Minnesota's ran its mayoral election in Minneapolis on that same system.
And they call it something different, I thought. They don't say they're a Democrat, it's some other name, but I can't remember. One?
Well, they've got the jungle primary out in California.
Yeah.
It's a different one as well.
In Louisiana.
Which again makes it interesting, largely because you could have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans that make it to the general election. Ultimately, then somebody doesn't feel like they're, in theory, wasting a vote. They have an opportunity to then still go in and pick a more moderate of the 2 if they're on the other side of the aisle.
Okay, well, we're going to circle back to social media again, a millennial favorite. Pew Research data indicates that 61% of millennials get their political news primarily from Facebook, compared to 51% of Generation X and 39% of baby boomers. Is social media the most effective strategy for winning the millennial vote, or do you think it's overemphasized? I know there's been so much talk about Facebook and even, what we saw on Friday with the indictments of the Russians getting involved. But still, I can say from my perspective, I see a lot more digital advertising by candidates. Do you think that is still the best way to reach, to get out your political message through Facebook, Twitter, or
Pandora.
you.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I'm running now, and we do a little bit of everything, and then we have ongoing just on my government side, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of that. So I guess I do everything. I still do radio, but I am taking out a banner on a blog that goes out, every day. So just trying everything. Because one of the problems is you can't not do some of the other traditional, because of what you just said, millennials don't vote as much as everyone else, so you still have to get your message.
So there's
to
still
those
door
folks.
knocking, that's always
for
going to
sure.
happen.
Absolutely.
Mailer.
Phone calls, the whole
walkies,
thing.
Robocall.
Yeah, lots of that sort of stuff. I mean, I look at what's going on, and having run, the top targeted race in the country, I can go and put out an ad on network television, which goes throughout the entire Chicagoland area for $750,000 for, in essence, a week's worth of ads, right? 1,000 gross rating points is what they talk about, enough to have an ad kind of supposedly sink in. That's $750,000. Now, the problem is that 10th district is fairly small. We're getting the 2nd district, the 1st district. We're getting everything, in essence, with that $750,000. Whereas you can use, again, social media, targeted digital ads to go specifically after a group of individuals. And again, it's getting nothing but more targeted as technology kind of evolves and expands, where this is going to be a huge part of people's strategy is how do I go after individual segments of people, whether it be I want to target and let people know about stuff that we were doing that are more concerned about the environment, right? Or we want to talk about somebody that really is interested in gun reform. I want to be able to send those particular ads that you can craft. I think that's going to continue to be a huge part. And I think it's really more focused on the millennials, maybe some of the Gen Xers. I'm still shocked that 39% of the baby boomers are getting it on Facebook. I think that number's high, but that's just my own, I think that's my own personal.
But also
sense.
the other
Everyone's
thing
on Facebook
is,
now,
Yeah, that's
when
true.
you say targeting, that means you have to spend the money on polling.
Sure.
Which is so expensive. Oh my God, also.
But even having said all this, none of us can turn on a television in Illinois right now without seeing a governor's race ad or 2 or 3, or listening to Rod Blagojevich on tape or whatever it is.
Okay.
So who are they targeting with those ads? I mean, are millennials seeing that? I mean, I don't know how you can't see that
Right,
if you're looking at a television, but is that the older generation? Is that, baby boomers? Because that is where the bulk of the money is going towards.
Oh, for sure. Without question, the bulk of the money
Right.
is going to go there. The difficulty, and again, if I was advising a candidate for state house, state senate, or even a congressional race, chances of you getting any airtime in this upcoming election cycle are going to be slim and none. I think it's going to be dominated by the gubernatorial race, where they're just going to buy up ads. And honestly, my guess is that the vast majority of well-informed voters, which you in the room I would count as the well-informed voters, certainly in that mix, will probably tune out 90% of those ads. Right? You've seen it, oh, forget it, change the channel, do something else. So how much of it really sinks in? I think it's going to be very difficult to have an ad sink in this election cycle.
People already know who they're voting for.
Right.
Okay, so let's turn to the Millennial Agenda. So let's talk a little bit about the key Millennial Agenda items and concerns. So recent council data has shown generation changes in opinion on issues like climate change, human rights, and immigration. Climate change, 52% of millennials believe it is a critical threat in comparison to 42% of baby boomers. Climate is increasingly important to millennials. On promoting and defending human rights in other countries, 45% of millennials consider it very important, compared to 29% of baby boomers. And then you go to the Syrian refugees, on accepting them, 51% millennials support this, compared to 38% Gen Xers, 39% baby boomers, and NAFTA, 59% of millennials think it is good, compared to 46% of baby boomers. So, Craig, why don't you unpack some of those findings for us?
So some of this has to do with the partisan makeup of the Millennial Generation. They are more likely to identify as Democrats. So when you see numbers saying they're more concerned about climate change, part of that is that more of them are Democrats. Democrats are more concerned about climate change. They're also much more diverse. In particular, they are much more Hispanic than previous generations. So when you look at issues like immigration, when you look at issues like NAFTA, U.S. relations with Mexico, millennials are slightly more pro-NAFTA, pro-immigration, pro-trade with Mexico in general. And then when you talk about human rights, I haven't seen it borne out so much on the aid side. They look mostly like other Americans when it comes to foreign aid or the role of promoting democracy abroad. Mm-hmm. One of the really interesting things, though, that I saw in the data is on defense spending. Now, traditionally, defense spending has been a pretty bipartisan and cross-generational concern. But starting in the early 2000s, the generations seemed to start to come apart. And millennials, a third of millennials say that they support cutting U.S. defense spending. It's far more than boomers or the silent generation, which came before the boomers. Gen Xers actually kind of fall in the middle. So you're starting to see this age split on future U.S. spending. Interestingly, you don't see it on Social Security. Millennials support expanding spending on Social Security, which isn't what you'd expect from some of these headlines that have been hyping, a generational clash between millennials and the boomers, and the boomers are taking all the jobs and the millennials are going to gut the Social Security. Well, no. It turns out that millennials are perfectly happy to spend money on Social Security.
That's interesting. So aside from some of those issues that we went over, can you think of what you consider would be major issues for millennials that you hear back from your constituencies and your districts? What are the big issues facing?
The economy and jobs, and with the people I hear from, they may have a job, but they may be underemployed, and also a lot around how much money they owe for college, and the job they have doesn't pay enough to, for them to move out, let's say, from their parents, or it affects the economy because they can't move out, they can't buy a car, or maybe wait to get married, because of the expense of their college tuition. So I know the average is, I think, $28,000 or $29,000, but if you go on to, become a lawyer, doctor, or whatever post, sure. MBA, that increases so much more. So that's something that I hear about. That's a concern.
Yeah, I would echo what Robin had to say on that. I hear a lot from millennials about education, certainly the cost of education, again, what kind of jobs are going to be available for them. We see more and more of millennials are going back to school, largely, especially during the Great Recession, because there weren't jobs available. So therefore, let me get more education and go back and do this. Obviously, I think the environment was one that was particularly important to some. Some foreign policy up in the 10th district, we would get some millennials very passionate about some foreign policy stuff, but that was rare. I recognize that was kind of a very small sliver, really more talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship. But beyond that, I think jobs in the economy and some of those things. Occasionally we'd hear about health care, but that was really seldom.
And for me, for the more active millennials, mainly African American, concerned about police community relations, civil rights, and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, big issue in Chicago. So we're going to talk about demographics and diversity of millennials a little. America has been in the process of profound demographic shifts. Millennials are more ethnically and racially diverse than older generations. Polling and political analysts suggest that young voters are more inclined to have liberal views on social issues like racial and gender equity, human liberties, and civil rights. So how can parties better represent and be accountable for an increasingly diverse America? I could start with you.
Well, I think that, and this is important to me too, I started the 2nd Congressional District Democrats, even though we'll let in independents too, but to try to build the bench. I don't think the Democrats have done a good job with building the bench. And I think that, groups tend to look at who's running for Congress, and we need to look at who's running for municipal boards, school boards, very important, on the local level. And I think that when we build the bench, we need to make sure we build a diverse bench, encourage younger people to run for office, but give them the support to do that. I think that's extremely important, and that's one thing I don't think that we did a good job of, and I do think the Republicans did a better job. I think they, reached down, you could tell me if I'm wrong, but, reached down into the local level and got more people elected, and maybe because, we're in Illinois and we know how Springfield is, and not necessarily so there, but in other places, I think they did a better job, frankly.
And you talked earlier about some recruitment efforts as well.
Sure. I think recruitment efforts are important. I do think, in terms of getting people engaged in politics is important, regardless whether you want to run for political office or not. Engagement is what makes a democracy vibrant. And I will say, as we look at millennials and kind of the shift that the millennials have brought to the political dynamic, especially as you look at like gender equality. Gender equality is, for most millennials, a given. Well, of course that's going to be the case. Whereas in the boomers, silent generation, some in Generation X are like, well, that's not necessarily the case. But I do think that you've seen that shift to really move the political discussion into an accepted viewpoint at this stage of the game. And so I do think that ethnically diverse kind of activity coming from the millennials does have an impact on policy. Largely, people have to be representative of their districts, and the more that the millennials are out there, are active, are engaged, your local representatives at any level have to be responsive. Otherwise, they're not going to be your representatives for long. And so that's why I think you're seeing some of this shift happen. I think it's a good thing, and we want a well-informed, well-engaged citizenry.
I think you've also seen this with the huge rise in women running for office in this coming year. Just a huge explosion of candidate recruitment among women. And I think it also runs into this trajectory among millennials, among women's education. Right now, of millennials who are in the right age range to have graduated college, so 25 and up, 39% of women have a college degree. In 1980, that same group, only 21%. There's been a huge rise in women's college education. And you're going to start seeing it the more and more representative our representatives are. We're going to have a lot more women.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we have some comments on some recent polling.
Thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. So good evening. My name is Jenna Burbridge, and I'm a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you once again to the panel for being here. We will be opening it up to audience Q&A, but just before we do, earlier on in the evening, we had asked you to answer a few questions through our Conferences IO polling app. We are now ready to reveal the results. They will show up on both screens. So the first question we asked was, in your opinion, is the Republican Party addressing concerns important to millennials and young voters? 9% said yes, 91% said no. The second question was, in your opinion, is the Democratic Party addressing concerns important to millennials and young voters? 65% said yes, and 35% said no. Interesting. Third question, how much confidence do you have in the two major parties to continue to address changing American concerns? Okay. Right. Let's see what that says.
That was my bad.
63% said not very much. Okay. And
13 said no confidence at all. So.
Oh my God.
yes,
There you
13
go.
said so no confidence at all. And the last question is, if voting today, the top issue of importance to me would be, let's see here. Okay, so the 26% said economy and jobs, 21% said justice reform and race relations, and 18% said foreign policy and diplomacy. Panelists, before we open it up to questions, please give us a brief one-sentence response on how your parties, one-sentence response on how your parties are dealing with economy and jobs. Please take it away, Congressman Dole.
Well, I think in the economy and jobs, we're going to take a look at the tax reform and see how that actually is going to impact jobs. There was a big plus with regard to subchapter S LLC small businesses, which do the vast majority of hiring. Corporations, C corporations, we'll see how that impacts actual jobs and how everyday paychecks are going to be impacted. That's what I think that you're going to hear in this midterm election is going to be talking about jobs in the economy is largely going to be around how the most recent Tax Cut and Jobs Act is impacting local economies around the country.
I'm not going to talk about the tax cut.
I'm just going to tell you what the Republicans are saying, economy and jobs.
Well, with the Democrats, again, as I said before, there's a big concentration on the economy with better jobs, better wages, and a better future. And I think there was hope. It needs some work on the infrastructure that bill that the president suggested. But we feel from that, and also looking at jobs around green energy jobs, technology, and training, that more people will be employed and not employed at a minimum wage employment, but a higher wage employment.
Craig, closing thoughts, one sentence?
From the Millennial Party, I would note that millennials are more likely to live in poverty than earlier generations of young Americans. They're less likely to be homeowners, and they do suffer from huge levels of student debt. So I think those are the issues going to be front of mind for them.
Great, thank you. We will open it up to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for me to call on you, and please speak into the microphone, and of course make sure your question is a question and not a statement. Okay, yes, the gentleman in the third row. Microphone's coming.
So my question is, how come no one really talks about the national debt or the continued running of the deficit? I mean, it wasn't even in one of the top issues listed there.
That's a great question. I'll jump in. And I think that largely you saw the Tea Party movement actually stem from people saying we need to be more fiscally responsible. And when we look at the spending that's gone on, look, Republicans and Democrats both have overspent. So please hear me, I'm not pointing the finger at one side saying they're responsible. Ultimately, the debt is ours. And if you haven't seen a debt auction, I'd recommend going to see a debt auction for the United States in terms of how we float our debt, how we sell it. It's impressive to see, but it's scary at the same time. And so as we look at the trillions of dollars that we have in debt and the deficit spending going on, this is obviously this administration is not afraid of deficits or debt. And so I think you're going to see that continue to rise. I think it's one that, frankly, we need to get away from partisanship on this one and say we need to be fiscally responsible. We need to try to grow our economy. But ultimately, the debt that we're talking about, as I talk to high schools and young people, I try to impress upon them that you're the ones that are going to be paying the debt, right? So this is going to be foisted upon future generations. So please understand that as we look at the pie, basically, when you look at the mandatory spending, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on our debt, that's a much larger pie. What was in the 60s about 35% of the pie now is at 70-some-odd% of the pie. We borrow basically everything else to run the government, which is pretty frightening to think about it. We're borrowing that each and every day to run all the programs that we know and rely upon, that we like. And so this is not something that just goes away, and it doesn't go with just campaign rhetoric. This is, and if you actually go through the exercise of doing a budget, it's pretty interesting to see what people are willing to cut and what they're not. But ultimately, what I may be willing to cut, Robin might say, not a chance, we can't possibly do that. And so that's really the dilemma that we're in. But ultimately, when we look at $21 trillion in debt, and it's going to rise precipitously, it should be a concern regardless of political party, because what it means is that we've got less and less dollars to spend on the things that we really want and need. Because more and more dollars has to go to the interest on the debt, because we're not going to default on the debt. Question is that what program gets cut?
Or whose taxes get raised.
Right.
And
also, I think that depending on who's in office, the other party, like usually the Republicans are the ones that say, no, watch the debt. But the tax cut and then the continuing resolution that we just passed, puts us further into debt. But if it was the other way around, you know, I'm talking about both, not one party or the other, but we jump depending on, you know, who's in charge.
Other questions? Yes, the lady in the fourth row. Just there. The microphone's on its way.
Thanks to everybody on the panel. I am curious about this comment that we don't have enough money to have kids or get married and stuff like that, but we want young millennials to be running for office, and the financial barrier. We want the millennials should be running for office, and we want more diverse people in office, but money is a huge barrier to that. I mean, it's a hurdle to be able to take off work or run a campaign and be able to fund a campaign. How can we be expected to do that with the current campaign finance situation?
But you know what, it's not just you guys. When I ran for the first time, I was 45 or 46, and it's a problem, period. Like I said, we need campaign finance reform because it keeps good people from running, winning, and actually wanting to stay in political life because it is so expensive. No, I understand what you're saying. That's what I'm saying. If we want you, we have to be able to support you. And frankly, a comment was made about so many more women are running, so many more people are running because of what happened in 2016, or however you felt about it. But I also feel a lot of people jumped in and they didn't really know what they were jumping into. Because one thing Bob and I talked about, when you come to Congress, you have to raise all of this money, but then we're also expected to pay a huge amount of dues. My dues, which is more on the bottom, are $250,000 to the Democratic Party. And even if no one ran against me again, I certainly can't go in my pocket and take that out, you know, or in my bank account. So it's not just millennials, it's a lot of different age people that face that. But also I'm saying, if we want you to run, we have to support you too, because it is difficult.
Yeah, no, I would be happy with $250,000 in dues. That would have been great.
The questions?
See, he was on better committees or something. That's why.
It was a lot more than that.
Yeah,
But the
yeah.
long and the short of it is that when you look at the thing that people don't understand when people want to run for office, in my last race, I did 2,200 events in the district. Now think about that, 365 days. Good chunk of those days are in Washington, right? Monday to Thursday. 2,200 events in the district. All in, both sides, we raised, Stern, what was it, 23 million? About $23 million for a congressional race. So go. Right now, we recognize we have campaign finance laws that you can only give up to a certain amount, which are not necessarily the same in the state. We need campaign finance reform. But ultimately, when you look at this, it's not easy. And when you're asking millennials to do it, I'm not saying every millennial should jump in and run for Congress, but we do want you to be engaged, and you need to start, you know, get engaged in what you're passionate about. You're passionate about the Park District, get engaged in the Park District. Library boards, do some of those other things, and pick your spot, whatever you want to do, and ultimately, you'll get up there. I mean, not every race is going to be like that one, but it is a huge, it's not kind of like a part-time deal. And so when people are saying, oh, well, you can just go ahead and do this. And again, it's a little bit different than what is portrayed in the public eye.
Other questions? Yes, the lady in the sixth row.
I just wanted to ask why you think millennials won't vote, because from what I've seen, there's been a lot of nationwide marches, which are mostly attended by young people. So I was just wondering if you have any statistics on why millennials aren't voting, and just your thoughts on that.
So in general, young people don't vote at the rates that older people do. It's easier for someone who's retired to take the morning off and go to a polling place and stand in line for a few hours. They're retired. They don't need to be at the office at 9 a.m. If you're working a job that doesn't have a regular schedule, maybe you got put on a different shift that morning. And, oh, I was going to go to the polls, but now I'm working, 6 to 2. Or I clopened, and now I'm exhausted and I need to go to sleep. Or I need to go take care of my elderly parent. Millennials do have other demands on their time. I think that as the millennial generation gets older, you'll see their voting rates get closer to what are now Gen X voting rates and what in the future, even boomer voting rates. There will definitely be efforts to turn out millennials this year in the midterm and in 2020, though. They are such a large potential voting bloc and they lean notably toward the Democratic Party, that the party will do a lot to try to turn them out. We'll see if it works.
Well, if I could just add to that, I mean, I think that goes back to the reaching out, our candidates at our different parties, making it easier for people who are working. I mean, there is early voting, so it's not just that day. There's lots of different ways to kind of reach out to not just millennials, but anyone who's working or has, lots of other responsibilities. But yeah, I think that kind of will go back to the parties, and whoever's more successful in really getting those people to the polls will end up, being victorious probably.
I think you're going to see an increase in millennials voting this next election.
I do too.
And perhaps in 2020 as well. Obviously, the fact that you're here, my guess is you're voting, and that your friends are probably as engaged as well. So probably, my guess is in the room, you're going to have close to 100% voting here in the room, whereas that's probably not going to be the case as we look at millennials, 20 to, is it 37 or something like that, 38.
37.
Adele, at the front row.
Yes, the mother.
Please wait for the microphone, Adele.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Two of you have, Robin and Bob, have talked about the importance of campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what you want to see with campaign finance reform?
What I would like to see, and I think they tried this before, that you only can spend a certain amount of money. When we were coming into this room, when you think about just two people running for governor, Governor Rauner and J.B. Pritzker have spent over $100 million, I think $106 million or something like that. That is ridiculous. Someone asked me back in D.C., I was telling Bob, do you have to be a billionaire to run for governor in Illinois? And how can a regular person compete with that? I mean, when you can just put your own money in. And so I would like to see some kind of cap, or it could be, public financing that's done, in some places. What one person said to me once, though, if you're well-known already, then you don't need as much money. And if it's a person that, just decide they're a great person and they decide they want to run, so if you put a cap on it, that person may need to spend more money. I mean, it's complex, but we can't continue in this manner. Or, do people like the idea? I mean, I don't do it, but I'm sure my fundraisers, which I did, but people that spend, 4, 5, 6 hours, 8 hours a day raising money. I ran in a special election. I took Jesse Jackson Jr.'s place, and for 3 months, I was in a room for, 6 to 7 hours a day, dialing for dollars, as we call it. And now, that's why I don't want to do it anymore, because I hate it, But you need money to run for office. That's just the bottom line.
Yeah, no, just to chime in, I mean, what would be, what would you change it to be? You saw McCain-Feingold come in, and I think regardless of what goes on, I think any kind of transparency is obviously a great thing to find out who's doing it. Right now, we go through great lengths in terms of, you get to see exactly who's donating to what. Now, where you don't get that is obviously when you go to the super PACs and that sort of stuff, which I think is problematic for our system. One thing that you could do is you could talk about equal airtime. Right, so if somebody's on air, we're going to give them each an allotted amount of airtime to do with as they choose, both on air and in radio and that sort of stuff. And again, cap kind of what could be spent. Those are all things that can be done. The difficulty is if someone's an incumbent that's been there for 10 years and you want to come in, you're really not, it's not a fair fight.
We have
Even though I
time
beat a
for
10-year incumbent.
a couple more questions.
And I ran for state.
The
Super
gentleman
lady.
in the second row, please. Thank you.
Hi, so I'd just like to continue a little bit about the last question about campaign finances. A lot of us I guess I'm not even a millennial. I'm still in high school right now. And so I'd like to give you guys some of my own experiences with this. I see a lot of people having concern about this advertising. A lot of the budget, obviously, from campaigns comes from advertising, both traditional and digital. And personally, I feel like that advertising, especially targeted advertising, is feels too much like a dystopian to me. Is there any chance
Like
that
what?
we
I'm sorry?
could?
Feels too much like.
Dystopian to me. Like we're targeting people to tell them more about your own views. It seems like a very biased source of information, and I was wondering if there's any chance we could create policy that could stop this kind of advertising, like TV ads, Facebook ads. These are obviously very biased because they come from one party. Why not have reporters or, so you say that a lot of millennials get most of their information from Facebook. And as we know, a lot of these sources are not credible. They're not credited news organizations. And people believe these sources without checking. I mean, they believe their headlines without even checking into the sources.
Thank you. Would you like to tackle the question? Congressman Dole, Congresswoman Kelly?
I think it would be very difficult. Again, the reason why people have websites and they go through and they fill out questionnaires and they do all this other kind of stuff is because you can't tell somebody a position. What are you about? And by the way, you've got 30 seconds. Go. Where do you begin? Right? So that's one of the things that you can't do with regard to an advertisement. If I'm going to be on television, and 30 seconds, a minute, I don't have enough to tell you about one particular issue, much less what we believe in. And so therefore, and then to have perhaps even the reporters do it. The reporters, we need the fourth estate, right? We desperately need them. And so when you think about the idea of the fake news, listen, we need to push back on this. We need reporters out there to report on what's going on, what's happening. We might have disagreements or they have their own take on what goes on in a particular issue, but ultimately their job is still going to be out there to report on the campaigns and tell you kind of their take on particular candidates and their positions. Probably not so good to have them be the ones doing the advertising. That's not going to work.
We have time maybe for one or two more questions. If we can, yeah, a question right there with the gentleman with his hand. Let's take your question. Let's take another question and we'll end there. Another question from the audience? Yes, the lady in the fourth row. So if we can start with your question first and then your question second.
All right, so I know Mr. Dole addressed this a little bit, but partisan gerrymandering in elections has a impact on not just the outcome of the elections, but the political discussion. So could any of you or all of you expand more on that?
And quickly your question.
Sure. Thank you, first of all. Party membership basically doesn't really exist for citizens anymore, but I'm really curious, you mentioned the dues that you pay. What does being in a party look like for you as a member of Congress? How do they show up?
It's a great question.
So what does being in the Democratic Party look like for me? I think I need to feel that I have a voice. I need to feel that, which I do, I need to feel that the overall values are similar, but I also need the Democratic Party to have a big tent. I don't expect everybody to feel like me. I expect, people to care about their fellow, human being and helping the least among us and, that kind of thing. But I just want to make sure I have a voice and people that don't have a voice as much, that we are representing them. I remember I was in class and I was reading something that even do-gooders or, that it still has a, middle class, upper middle class tilt to it because they may be the ones that can take off work or, like those kind of things, is that they're still not the voice for those that are poor or working poor. Is very, very difficult. But I want to be a part of a party that's a big tent and is not just tolerant, but welcoming of differences.
And to your question about gerrymandering, so I think Congressman Dole touched on this a little bit. There's a big debate about whether gerrymandering, the extent to which gerrymandering affects polarization. My personal sense is that it doesn't, and I'll explain briefly why. So the states aren't gerrymandered at the national level for the Senate, but we still see strong polarization in the Senate. And the effect of gerrymandering at the state level for congressional districts isn't to create like super safe districts, at least that's not usually how you'd want to do it. You're creating edge districts where you'll win with 55% of the vote. Not 80%, because then you're just wasting a bunch of votes. You want that nice 55, 54, 53. Now, if you cut it too close and there's a wave election going the other way, you're going to lose a whole bunch of seats. And if you look at projections for the 2018 outcomes for just how many seats the Democrats would win, you get to these interesting tipping points where if they win another 2% of the vote nationally, suddenly they pick up another 10 or 15 or 20 seats because some of these states have been gerrymandered in like very narrow ways. What it does do, though, is it does distort the representativeness at the state level. So you can have a state where the vote is split 50-50, but the representation is split 70-30. This can be very discouraging, also produces all sorts of weird and bad political outcomes.
Also, another thing that the Congressional Black Caucus has discussed, the idea of putting almost everybody black in one district. And you could speak to some members, and they feel like they have to have, 60% or 65% African American in their district. But then there's other members like me and others that don't feel like we need, overwhelming amount of African Americans. And actually, we feel like it backfires because if you put, 65, 70% African Americans in this district, then it's less likely that, we'll win in other districts. So we don't want to see that clustering either. And actually, there's a little better job being done because there's 49 of us, and we represent 78 million people. And to everyone's surprise, only 7 to 19 million are African American. So there are enough of us that, maybe 22% of the district is black or, something like that. So we don't want to see the clustering either.
Great,
And the
thank
Supreme
you.
Court will be ruling on gerrymandering cases this term, so look for that.
Quickly, if I can just.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Let me just, on the gerrymandering, so if you have a 55-45 district, where are you spending your time? On the 55. Where's the 45? Left out. If we had more districts drawn 50-50 type districts, we'd have a lot more cooperation going on in Congress today. And so honestly, when we talk about what's going on, the number one thing that we can do to get more cooperation going in Congress is to get rid of the partisan gerrymandering that goes on and actually focus on drawing more 50-50 type districts. With regard to kind of the party, your question in terms of what makes you feel to be part of a party, ultimately, I agree with Robin. We want a big tent party. We want a party that actually is welcoming to folks. And I stand up, a lot of times I don't agree with everything Republicans are doing. And that's part of the difficulty, right? It's not like does one person represent the Democratic Party and therefore everybody's got to stand in line, or the Republican Party. Again, that to me is maddening. That everybody says no matter what Donald Trump says, all Republicans believe that. Well, that's just not the case. And so I think it's incumbent upon if you want to talk about it being a strong party, you're going to have disagreements, and you need to, about what direction they go. I view it us being able to stand up to where we think that they're wrong.
Thank you. That was more than 30 seconds, but thank you very much. That's all we have time for, ladies and gentlemen. The cash bar will remain open for networking and further conversation. Please join me in thanking our speakers tonight.